I thought that it was important that we start first by kind of running through the history of remote supports. And I want to do that just to kind of let you know where we've come from, where we're going, and just kind of how this service has evolved, because the example of how this service has evolved, I think that we're going to kind of look at it from a national perspective and the way that this service has been implemented across the various states in the country. But that example can really be applied to your specific situation, whether you're looking at this from an agency perspective, whether you're looking at this as a service coordination organization or a state. A lot of the things that you're going through, or that we're going to talk about, will have been gone through before. So let me go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll kind of run through this. So hoping everybody can see this okay. Again, as we move through this, as an attendee, you're on mute, but please do feel free to throw questions in the Q&A, and I will get to those as quickly as we can and make sure that those get answered. So I wanted to first start with the history of remote supports, and kind of to just tell the story of how this service has evolved from 2002 till today. And a lot of what we're going to talk about, vendors, if you guys are on and have something that you want to share, as I'm going through this, something specific about how you entered this timeline and or any insights, please feel free. We didn't really discuss that, but please feel free. So the service was actually, the first example that I could see of this service was done by the University of Wisconsin, the Wiseman Center. Was a project that they had started called Sound Response. Sound Response was installing an array of sensors only with two-way audio communication to an individual's home with a disability, linking them back to a remote caregiver that could provide remote supports through that technology in their home. So this was a project that was just started by the University of Wisconsin to kind of explore this model, to see if it would work. And the people that started that actually ended up starting another company, which we'll do here in just a second. So that was in 2002. Right around that time is when the AT Act first kind of defined what is assistive technology. And then also during that same time frame, just to kind of give you some perspective on where we're at, that was actually the year that Facebook was founded. So 2002, which was 17 years ago. So this service has been around in one form or another since 2002. In 2006 to 2007 is really when the service kind of started to really take off across the country. That Wiseman, the project coming out of the Wiseman Center there in the University of Wisconsin, the first company to actually provide remote support services was a company called Night Owl, and Chris Patterson was one of the founders and is on here today to help us with this training. But that project at the Wiseman Center actually spun out, and some of the people that were running that project founded the company called Night Owl. Also around that same time, two other companies were formed. One is Simply Home, and we have Drew, who is one of the founders of Simply Home. Simply Home was spun out of a service provider organization that was providing services in Wisconsin and North Carolina. They saw the benefits of tech. They started using technology to support people, and officially formed Simply Home as a technology solution to support people with disabilities. At that same time, Rest Assured was founded, which was one of the company that I was with at the time. So you have these three types of vendors that were entering and trying to provide this new service called remote supports. And at this time, it was so new that we were all, honestly, we were all trying to figure it out, right? We had an idea on what we thought the systems could do. We were kind of testing them out. We were doing demo homes. We were operating in very small pockets of the country, typically in, kind of our own backyard types of situations. And really exploring what were the limits of tech, what could the tech actually do, how were people going to perceive this service, and was it a model that could actually become a service that was going to be utilized in the system. So at this point, it was a lot of exploring. There was no benchmark for us to go back to reference, and we were basically creating a service model from scratch. which was scary and was also very, very exciting to see something new starting and to see the response of the people that were receiving the services. At this point, the perception, I think, of remote supports, the way that I could sum it up the easiest and the response that I got by far the most was, when we're talking about remote supports, it's a variety of different devices, but as soon as cameras brought up, it was, oh my gosh, no way, no, there's no chance. This is an invasion of privacy. This is Big Brother. That was kind of the response that we were getting at this time. In the bottom right-hand side of this image, you will see a map. That map is actually showing where waiver funding was available. So Indiana was the first state to fund remote supports through their Medicaid waiver program. There was one state in that year that was funding it. Also, in 2006 is when the iPhone came out, the first iPhone. And I was looking for a picture of an iPhone and I found this. It looks like you can actually still buy the first model of the iPhone for $5,200 if anybody's interested. I doubt anybody is. Moving forward a couple of years, Syngistics was the next kind of remote support vendor to enter the market. They're based up in Minnesota, and we will have representatives from Syngistics joining us today as well. During this time, the vendors, Syngistics, Rest Assured, Night Owl, Simply Home, we were all working very collaboratively, even though we were kind of competitors. We were all working very collaboratively to educate the system. And when I say the system, I'm talking about state regulatory entities, local government entities, the provider community, the advocacy community, the service coordination community. There was a lot of education that had to occur because when people first heard of the service, their first instinct was not always the most positive. Once we started talking about some of the safeguards that we were building into these systems, the way that we were providing the service, the way that the individuals were really driving choice, that's when that was the kind of education, I guess, that was occurring at that point. In 2009 is when the state of Ohio was first approached about the inclusion of remote supports in their waiver program. And Ohio is an example that I've got kind of weaved into the presentation today. So there is a reason that I'm sharing that with you, but just kind of tuck that in the back of your mind. 2009 is when Ohio was first introduced to the concept of remote supports. Also in that year is the first year when you kind of look up that year in tech, it was the first year that there were more devices connected to the internet than there were humans. So the Internet of Things kind of became a thing back then. 2011, 2 years after 2009, obviously, is when Ohio did finally include remote supports in their waiver program. So the reason I mention that again is that there was a 2-year period between 2009 and 2011 that the state of Ohio, just like any other state out there or any other funding source, has to really go out and investigate this and talk to their constituents and see how other people are regulating it and explore how to fit this service into their current service delivery model. How do we fund it? What levels do we fund it at? How do we regulate it? So that process took 2 years, and that is an important thing to know. So if you're a state out there looking at this, we will be talking about some of the kind of the steps that states should be looking at as they're looking at this service as well today. So I just wanted to make sure you were aware that this is not a quick process because it needs to be thought through very well and worked on. You can see up there, also during that time, once Ohio did start doing it, the guy that just stood up and walked his name is Barry Hunt. He is the CEO of WinRead. They are a local provider community there in Ohio, and when remote supports weren't available waiver service, they wanted to start providing that. So Jared and his team created a remote support platform and integrated that as a new service that their agency was able to offer both to the people that they serve as well as to other individuals that live in the state of Ohio through the waiver program. 2011 is also when GPS was first introduced in phones, just to kind of show you how remote supports is evolving as tech as we know it today. Kind of commercially available tech has evolved as well. 2014, 2015, you can kind of see on the right-hand side of the screen here, We have more and more remote support vendors entering the market. We had another one pop up called Together Tech. They're based out of the state of Missouri, that's providing remote supports. And I think that they're primarily focused in the state of Missouri still today. They may be looking to kind of expand, but we're starting to see more and more states fund the service. So if you look in the upper left-hand side, you can see how remote supports has kind of spread from Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia started funding it, Missouri did, Kansas had incorporated it into their daily rate. Minnesota and Wisconsin were funding it. I don't believe it was through a waiver at that point, but they were funding the service. And Montana was funding it through a waiver program. And I'm going to come back and talk about Kentucky here in just a second. So 2016, I think, it really felt like the tipping point in the service. And I don't have any real data to validate that 2016 was the tipping point because of this data point and that data point. It was just when the conversation changed as somebody that experienced it on a day-to-day basis. And you can see what's happened to the map. More and more states are funding this. We have many more remote support vendors available for people to choose from. We have Creatabilities, which is on today, based out of Indiana, that was providing the service. A company called Med for All out of Ohio, Safe and Home out of California, who will also be joining us today as a presenter. Home Smart Assistant based out of Texas, and then Total Home Care Solutions was also in. Nick, correct me if I've got your date wrong here, but I think it was around 2016 that Total Home Care Solutions, again, another waiver service provider that started providing remote supports in addition to the more traditional services that they were providing. So you can see that there's funding. There's more and more service providers available in the marketplace. And really, as I said, the conversation kind of changed at that point. It was no longer these vendors going out and, I hate to say it this way, but kind of begging or trying to convince people to use the service. Enough people had used the service across the United States, and people were hearing the success stories from their colleagues or from someone that was actually receiving the service, and those success stories were really influencing people's local bubble of influence, and the conversation just changed. It was, hey, we should be looking at remote supports instead of giving all the reasons that they didn't want to do remote supports, I guess. One of the things that really helped with that conversation change was some kind of strategic initiatives around the country. One of those being ARM, which is the Minnesota Provider Trade Association. They were hearing the same stories, seeing the successes, especially from Syngistics up there in Minnesota, who was a member of ARM, and realized that as a trade association, they needed to do something to make the information and education available to their members, as well as to the disability community in the state of Minnesota. So they did form a technology resource center, which was an educational platform that was sharing success stories, sharing assessment tools, sharing documents and regulatory policy, and really trying to make it easy for people to go in and learn about this new and valuable service. Same thing happened at the University of Ohio State. I should say the Ohio State University. The Nysonger Center there and DODD started a tech initiative where they were basically doing the same thing. They set up a website where they were sharing information and success stories and the know-how to do remote supports. And there were a few other things that I'm going to get to here in just a second. Tennessee in 2017 launched an initiative where they had some dollars, and Tennessee took a very thoughtful approach on how they incorporated technology into their waiver program. They did not go full steam ahead and we're just going to amend the waiver, and if we build it, they will come type of an approach. They realized that prior to doing all of that work and amending a waiver, that there was a lot of upfront education and training and knowledge dissemination that needed to occur within the disability community before those changes were made in a funding structure. And we'll kind of get into a little bit more of exactly how Tennessee did that. But they're a good example. If you're someone from a state, I would really recommend looking at Tennessee's model as well as some other states. So 2018, here's kind of the map. You can see the map has really kind of come alive. Green states are funding it through Medicaid waiver programs. The states with yellow are funding it through a waiver program, but there were issues, or it wasn't being utilized in that state to the full capacity. Kentucky being one example that I really like to talk through. They did include it in a waiver program, but the way that they structured it, the funding, there was a huge financial disincentive for the utilization of the technology. And I'll talk a little bit more detail about that in a minute. But the way that states fund this and the way that they regulate this is very important. And we're going to talk about how that needs to happen and occur and make it kind of a win-win-win for all people involved. A win first for the individual, a win for the service provider organizations, and a win for the system. New Mexico is in red. New Mexico is a state that actually did go through the process of amending a waiver, funding it through the waiver program, regulating it, and no one utilized it. And at the next waiver amendment, it was removed. So it was kind of a good example of that. If you can't just start funding this in your waiver program and expect that everybody's going to use it, because it's a new thing, and we need to do education and a lot of things, other things need to occur before utilization will actually happen. So here's the picture in 2019. And again, you guys are going to get a copy of this. So you don't need to be furiously writing down the names of these vendors. There are, that I'm aware of, 16 different vendors across the United States that are providing remote supports in one form or another right now. And you can see the list of the vendors here, just to kind of give you a sense on where some of these are coming from. We have Missouri on the top here. Winreese out of Ohio, THS is out of Ohio, Electronic Caregiver, I believe, is out of Arizona, Creatabilities is out of Indianapolis, Rest Assured is out of Lafayette, Indiana, Syngistics is out of Minnesota, Hero is out of Missouri, Good Life is out of Kansas, Night Owl is out of Wisconsin, Med4All is out of Ohio, Simply Home out of North Carolina, and Safe at Home is based in California. So you have a lot of choices now on remote support vendors. No matter where you live in the United States, there is a remote support vendor that is able to provide services to you if you have the funding and the regulatory environment to support it. And we'll talk a lot more about that. So anybody that is looking at remote supports or any disability system that is utilizing remote supports is going to follow what this technology adoption curve. And the technology adoption curve is not a concept that I've come up with. It is a pretty well-known thing that any new technology, whether that's a new phone that comes out, a new Internet of Things device, a new whatever it is, any new piece of technology is going to follow this standard technology adoption curve. So on the bottom of the graph here, we have time. So we're starting at the implementation of that new piece of technology, and time is on the left-hand side here. And then after all of the people that have adopted technology, go through the time, the future is on the right-hand side here. And then the adoption rate of that tech is represented by this kind of bell-shaped curve here. So as people first start to adopt the technology, we have the people that are called the innovators. These are the first people that utilize it. They're the ones that go out there and just say, yeah, that looks great, I'm gonna do it. They don't need anybody else to have done it first. They're the first people to adopt the service. So they represent a pretty small portion of the people that are going to adopt the service. And then you have the early adopters, the people that are following just after that. And then the majority of people are adopting technology here in the early majority or the late majority phase. And then obviously you will have some people that are just kind of taking their time and adopting later than most people, and those would be the laggards. But any new piece of technology, including remote supports, is going to follow this adoption curve. So we're not going to start funding this service and making it available in a waiver system or anywhere, and then all of a sudden magically everybody starts using it. People, culturally, will go through this adoption curve. And I do actually have some data. The red lines that you can see on the graph here are actual utilization numbers that came out of the state of Ohio. And as you can see, represented on this graph here, it is pretty much following that standard adoption curve. Let me kind of zoom in here a little bit. So 2011 is when they first started funding the service. Obviously, 0 people were using it at that point. 2009 is, remember, if you remember back for some other slides, is when they were first approached. We had that 2-year period where they were setting up reimbursement and structure and that kind of thing. But 0 people using it in 2011. 2013 went up to 53, 14 is 95, and I have 500 plus here. I think the number was approaching right around 600 now in late 2019. Talking with some of these remote support vendors, they are unable. Some of the remote support vendors on here are challenged to keep up with the adoption of remote supports in the state of Ohio right now. That's how fast it is occurring in the state of Ohio now, because as you can see, based on these lines, we are now, Ohio is not even, I would say just maybe barely entering the early majority phase, meaning that the only adoption that has occurred during these almost 600 plus users of remote support in Ohio now have been the innovators and the early adopters. And we as a system need to be prepared for this. I don't think that we have the capabilities or the infrastructure to be able to support this many people. And as a system, we need to be aware of this adoption curve because it is coming and we will get there. I'm sure the market will adjust, the vendors will adjust to be able to deal with it. But the main purpose of this slide was just to show you that even if you feel like you have not done remote supports yet, just because you are on this training today, you are one of basically an early adopter. That's how early we are, even though the service has been around since 2002, if you remember back earlier. Since 17 years, the service has been around and we still haven't exited the early adopter phase and into the majority phase yet. So we're still at the very beginning. I just see maybe a chat question come in. And I will get to that in just 1 second. So hang tight and I will answer that. So I want to kind of overlay, the data there is pretty evident on how the utilization is going to increase, right? But that's just one piece of it. What is the perception? How has the perception of the service changed? And, I was trying to, come up with some wording that was very professional and scientific and, data driven, but, the emotional part of it is a big thing with this service. So these next few slides are more of an emotional journey that the service has gone through. 2009, it was kind of more of, you want to do what? That was kind of the reaction and the response from people. Like, I can't believe this. This is crazy. This is never going to happen. No way somebody would want this. This is, that was the impression. Moving forward a little bit to 2013, the perception kind of changed to, well, okay, maybe, but let's talk about this a little bit more, right? We're not ready to jump into this, but we'll listen. We'll talk about it. That was kind of the change that occurred between 2009 and 13. 2016 was the tipping point, if you remember, right? Where that conversation kind of changed. 2019 now, and this is actually a quote from the Nysonger study on remote supports, which you will have a link to that when I send you the guide after today. The quote that's really stood out to me is that this is like having my own personal bodyguard. And there are many other quotes that pull on the heartstrings a lot more than that, but perception has changed. The data is there. The individuals themselves that are receiving this service are talking about the benefits. They're excited about it. They're excited about what it's doing in their lives. And the perception has changed. So it is a great time to be looking at remote supports.